cocktail parties, whenever the subject of Reagan came up for a year, I would say to people, well, he was in the cavalry. And they'd say, where the hell did you hear that? I'd say, well, the president told me at dinner the other night. And they'd all be whispering at the end of the table, who is that guy? Who is he?
Craig Oliver's been a reporter for over 50 years and is currently CTV's chief political correspondent and the co-host of Question Period. Born and raised in rough circumstances in Prince Rupert, British Columbia, he's pretty much seen it all, and he still knows where the bodies are buried. In 2011, he published his autobiography, Oliver's Twist, and we sat down with him in the shadow of Parliament Hill to hear some of his stories.
Craig, I want to ask you about your youth and growing up in Prince Rupert, because one of the things about your book that really struck me was, now I don't know whether I want to use this word or not, you may disagree with me, but it seemed to me that you had a Dickensian miserable childhood in Prince Rupert. Was it?
Well, I'm not sure it was miserable. It didn't seem miserable to me at the time, but if I read about myself at that age, I guess it was pretty miserable. It wasn't all unhappiness. I lived with, I think, 5 different families in the space of maybe 8 or 9 years. Most of them were nice people, not all of them.
Yeah.
One family in particular I lived with for quite a long time, and the woman, Mabel, who ran the household, was not a pleasant person. She was vindictive, mean, quite hard on me, reminded me regularly that I would never amount to anything, that my mother had left me and she was an immoral woman. And
she beat you with a belt at one point.
Well, that didn't happen regularly, but it did happen.
Yeah.
In those days, men sharpened their razors before safety razors on big long straps.
Yeah.
And they sharpened it. And she put that to my buttocks for some occasion. And I don't, to this day, I can't remember what for. I think that you do block out a lot of those memories.
Yeah.
I remember one occasion when, by mistake, when I was going to bed, I called her Mummy, and she upbraided me very severely. I'm not your mummy. Your mummy's an immoral woman who left you, and you should, that.
Yeah.
I remember that just very distinctly.
Both your parents were alcoholics, right?
Yes, they were.
Yeah. Your father actually sold booze.
Yeah, my father was a bootlegger.
Yeah.
As I say, we would have been as rich as the Bronfmans, except he loved his own product too much, like any good salesman would. So he came in and out of my life. My memory of him is like a badly edited home movie. He'd pop up, but he did pay to keep me. He shopped me around to families who needed money, and then he would send them checks to look after me. So it isn't as if he sort of abandoned me in that sense. But after my mother disappeared, he just couldn't. He's not a guy to look after kids, and his work took him out late at night. And I was a waif for a while there, wandering the streets of this tough little town in northern British Columbia next to Alaska. But I survived it all.
Now it's interesting, at one point, and this is what struck a chord for me. He sold the Crown Royal, right? One of the
that's right.
And so you had your marbles in the Crown Royal velvet bag, which I did as a kid as well.
Yeah. Well, look, I was the most popular kid in elementary school because I gave them all these little purple bags with a gold cord to keep their marbles in. My father did not drink cheap booze, not for him. And he went to jail eventually. He got nailed for bootlegging. And we had moved to Prince Rupert because he had been counterfeiting ration cards down there. So he was charged and convicted there, so he thought, I better skip town. And then he got nailed in Prince Rupert, went to jail for a while. When he came back, he set up a floating crap game in the St. Elmo Hotel. And sometimes I'd spend the weekend in the room where the game, it was actually a poker game,
right,
with all these men sitting around smoking and all the chips and money on the table.
What a childhood that must have been. I mean, you came through it very well, considering. I think a lot of people probably wouldn't have.
Well, I think you go, with a childhood like that, I think you go one way or the other. I think it can, the lack of self-esteem can crush you, or I think you feel the need to validate yourself. You want to be somebody, and that drives you all your life.
Yeah.
And there has to be a point where you've got to learn to relax a little. I think I started that about 65, just where you're at now.
Yeah, okay.
But it took a long time.
Oh, thank God I can relax.
I think the other thing about it is you learn very quickly things that most people don't learn until they're much older, and that is that you can't trust anything anybody says. You can only trust what they do, and that's how you have to make judgments about people. But you also learn the wrong things. You learn not to let people too close to you, not to let people know they're hurting you, and it takes a long time to sort of let your guard down as you go through life in that regard. And I think people who've dealt with me have found that sometimes a real frustration, that I won't let people close.
Right. Tell me about getting into broadcasting. I mean, you went through a number of jobs. You worked on a ship for a while.
Yeah, I was in the Navy. I joined the Navy Reserve after being a sea cadet. So I spent the summer at sea on an old bucket of a ship. It was the last coal-driven. I mean, they literally had guys down in the engine room shoveling coal into the fires and the boilers. And that's where the expression, by the way, "keep a cool tool" comes from, because the shovels would get real hot, and they had to plunge them into water to cool them off every now and then.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm making a mental note of that one. I'll be using that one at the next party I go to. Yeah. Okay. So broadcasting, you ended up being the youngest broadcaster at the CBC in
Ever? Probably. I was 17 and I was a full-time staff member. Well, what happened is, during the war, there were 15,000 American troops stationed in Prince Rupert. They were either on their way to the end of their lives, many of them in the Pacific, that awful war there, or they were working in the Alaska Highway. And so the American Army, who always look after their boys, built a radio station for them. Imagine that, a whole radio station. And when the war ended, they thought, what are we going to do with this radio station in Canada? So they gave it to the CBC. So you had this sort of microcosm of the CBC empire, all in this tiny little town. Producers, executive producers, announcer, operators, technicians, secretaries, a miniature CBC. It was, when I think back on it, it was very funny. And anyway, I got hired there after being a summer relief announcer. I got hired. I was your host on the coast with the most. That was it.
And you had to do an audition, right? I mean, they auditioned you. You had to.
They sent from Toronto the CBC audition, which was a classical music program, and so I had to sort of learn to pronounce French, German, Italian. So I went to people who were experts in these languages, and they told me how to pronounce these things. You know, Goethe, Damerung, and all that stuff. That if you were applying for a job in Toronto, you had to know these things.
And you had to do, you wrote about having to intone live from Massey Hall without having a clue what Massey Hall was.
That's right. I had no idea what Massey Hall. Tonight from Massey Hall, so-and-so will be leading the Toronto Symphony Orchestra, you know, that kind of stuff. And the other thing is, we also had to clean the place. You know, there was no union then. And one of the things we had to do was we had to clean the building every Tuesday. So I've always remembered this. I'm in there cleaning a toilet bowl, scrubbing away. And the senior announcer said, "Oliver, do you know why we're doing this?" I said, "No, sir." You know, you called your boss sir these days. He said, "We're doing this so that our powerful, important jobs will not make us too proud." I've never forgotten that.
And perhaps he was right.
He was right.
Tell me about how you ended up in television.
Well, I moved to Regina, which to me was huge, big leagues. The CBC transferred me there. I couldn't believe it. That was the biggest city I'd ever seen, really. And Winnipeg would come in and do stuff. We had no television in Regina, and they would hire me to ask questions. So for a long time, I had the best-known back of the head in Saskatchewan, because I was never on camera. It was always the back of my head. So I started doing television there and went to Winnipeg and did more television there and so on.
So, tell me about what it took to do that. For a young, I mean, you have to have a certain amount of self-confidence to be able to pull that off at a tender age.
Well, I always loved theater. And, you know, this business, a lot of it is acting. And so what I did when I got to Regina is I actually took acting. I went to the School of Drama and took acting and took voice. Made a big difference to me. Yeah. Quite often, what we're doing is acting. We write a script and then we go read it on camera. So it was natural for me. I didn't find television any problem. No. I never have.
Tell me about the switch from CBC to CTV.
Well, this was, I was very frustrated at the Corp. Does that
They're ringing some bells for me.
But, I mean, I think we both know that it's a precious place. I mean, it's an important national institution. But
precious
anyway, working there,
the word, by the way.
Well, working there can get frustrating, as everybody who works there. You know, everybody at the CBC, everywhere you go in the world, No matter if you're in Italy or if you're in Russia and you're with other CBC people, you're never talking about what you're covering or the great event. You're all complaining about the CBC all the time.
True.
That's what they do. So I just was offered a job to put the Canada AM on the air. I was then a producer of the CBC National News, and I thought, I'm getting out of this place. So I went over and to put Canada AM on the air in 1972.
Yeah.
I was the first producer of it.
Now, you have a great story, and I'm going to get you to repeat it here. A great story about covering the CTV, trying to beat CBC at its own game by covering the 72 election with a fancy new computer.
That was I went over there with a guy named Don Cameron, who was the executive producer. We were both close friends of Lloyd Robertson, who we'd left behind at the Corp. And we thought this was going to be our first election, because a whole bunch of us from the Corp went over to CTV. It's going to be our first big, and election broadcasts really put networks out on stage. They're your big moment when you show your stuff. So we decided that we would hire a computer company to do the first election with computerized returns. These guys swore they could do it. They had everything all organized. We were going to beat everybody in the world. So we were going to humiliate our pal Robertson with his show, which was fine. Election night comes along, the returns are coming in from Newfoundland, and we're way ahead of the CBC, way ahead, and we thought we're going to blow these guys away. But soon as Newfoundland ended, and the big returns started to come in from the Maritimes and elsewhere, the computer slowed down, and finally just went off the air. The results were frozen on the screen up above us, and I think probably there would have been 30 electeds by then, in the whole country. So what do? Well, what we decided to do was steal results from CBC Radio. So Harvey Kirk was the anchor, and I hid under the table with CBC in my ears, and I would be putting up returns and electeds and defeateds to Harvey. And then he'd be reading them very elegantly, as Harvey always did. And after a while, we kind of got tizzy. And we just started declaring people elected on the basis of what I felt would probably happen. So we were beating the CBC with our own returns. And we got giddy. We were laughing hilariously about this ridiculous thing we were doing. Anyway, it wasn't one of the great election nights.
No, evidently not.
No.
But Canada AM, though, it's still going today. It's so strong. CBC has actually never tried to take CTV on in the morning.
No, I'm surprised at that. They haven't. No, it's become a real institution.
Yeah.
But the early days were tough. One of the things that surprised us most was some people can't do mornings.
Yeah.
You'd hire these people and they'd be gloomy and angry and.
Well, they got to get up at like 3 o'clock or something, right?
3 o'clock in the morning. Toughest thing I've ever done. Yeah. Morning show.
Carol Taylor was the first.
Carol Taylor. We hired Percy Saltzman to be the serious guy who we thought would drive the show, and Carol, because she was pretty and she'd been a beauty contestant. She won Miss Toronto or something. It turned out though that Percy was so serious, such an intelligent guy. He wanted every interview to go into tremendous detail. He wanted so much time. He also very much came from the left, so every interview he did, he was hammering them over some leftist issue. And Carol was real smart, as well as being pretty, we discovered very quickly. So what started to happen was Percy was turning people off, and Carol was turning them on. And finally, Percy couldn't stand the pressure. We had to have separate story meetings every morning because he wouldn't talk to her. Oh my God, it was such a mess. Finally, one day he blew up in the coffee shop at her, wild obscenities, stormed out angrily, and basically never came back.
Yeah. Now that's all the stuff that came out of Percy Saltzman after he passed away. I think was astonishing to those of us who remembered him as the nice weather guy who flipped his chalk at the end. Let's talk a little bit about you getting into. You started covering politics while you were out there in the Midwest, and you got. I guess it was just a matter of part of it, at least, was being in the right place at the right time, doing the right thing in the right place at the right time.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the people that you were covering out there ended up being major players when you ended up coming to Ottawa and doing the federal scene.
Diefenbaker, Tommy Douglas. But the big thing, the lucky thing for me was I saw when I moved to Regina, they didn't have any political coverage. They didn't have a news department, so I said, we should be covering the legislature every day. So they said to me, okay, put a line in the legislature, and that was one thing about the CBC. You could just, there was lots of room to be creative if you had the right bosses. So I started doing daily reports from Parliament there, from the legislature, and Tommy was a premier. But the interesting thing was, what you had in Saskatchewan then was what we later had everywhere in the country and now have in the United States. We just had left and right. We had a totally polarized political system in Saskatchewan. And you really learned, I learned the politics that was to come for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
I learned all the issues on the left and the right.
Yeah. When you started covering federal politics, well, I want to ask you about, because you write about this in the book a couple of times, you touch on it, how you, and it's impossible to work in Ottawa and cover federal politics for as long as you have, and not get to know many of these people on a personal level. And then it becomes the question of, where do you draw that line, that little line that keeps shifting all the time, as they say, that little sucker keeps moving between the personal relationship and what you have to do as a journalist to cover some of these guys. Have you struggled with that at times?
Yes, I have. And I confess in the book that I became far too close to Trudeau and to the Trudeau cabinet. They were my friends. That's where I spent all my time, with Trudeau's cabinet members and sometimes with Trudeau as well. And I realized that I'd compromised myself, because I'd be out for dinner with cabinet members. They'd be talking about that day's cabinet meeting, and I couldn't, of course, report this. And no reporter should be learning a lot of stuff that he can't report. Yeah. So finally the company and I agreed that I'd go to Washington and be deloused for a few years. It turned out to be 9 years. And when I came back, I never made that mistake again. Yeah. And my rule now, and I have lots of friends who in politics and all parties, right up until today. I mean, I was out for dinner last night with some people who are in the cabinet and some others, is that, I don't let them compromise me by telling me things I can't use, or they need to know if they are going to tell me something, eventually it'll get used. Yeah. Somehow or other, it'll get out there. Yeah. So that's got to be the rule. And as long as we both understand that, you can be friends. Yeah.
When you talk about going to Washington to be deloused, as you put it, at the time, certainly later on, it became evident that it was probably a good thing for you in your career that you did that. But at the time, did you feel like you were being exiled?
Just a little. Yeah. I was being exiled. But my bosses were good guys, and we agreed that this would be a good thing for me. And after all, Washington, many reporters will spend a lifetime fighting to get there. Yeah. And at the time, it was the Reagan administration. I think most people recognize that Reagan was one of the great presidents of the 20th century. We had Latin America blowing up. I was running all around that country. Mm-hmm. So it was a very exciting time in my life. And I learned a lot. It was like a master's degree in American politics, which is for anyone who goes there.
It took a while for you to get your press accreditation when you first got down there, but you were feeling pretty good when you finally got an invite to the White House.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Well, you got to know that a Canadian reporter in Washington is right up there with CBC Radio. You're not really a very important player. It's pretty hard to get an interview with even a senator or anybody important. So I get this blue bordered envelope in the mail. Ron and Nancy Reagan would like to have you over for a private dinner at the White House. So at first I thought this was a put on by people in the office, but it wasn't. And so I phoned the White House social secretary, and I could feel the frost in her, like, who is this guy calling about Ron and Nancy? Half an hour later, she calls back, very warm and friendly. Yes, Ron and Nancy, the president and Mrs. Reagan are looking forward to having you over. So I went over.
Who were the other guests going to be?
Well, it was Catherine Graham, the owner of the Washington Post and half the television stations in America. Her editor, Ben Bradley of Watergate fame, he sat just two down from me. Bob Hope popped in to have a drink but couldn't stay.
Al Haig?
Al Haig, the Secretary of State at the time. So it was, my kind of people. At one point, I decided that for the pure joy of it, I have to go out onto the Truman balcony and enjoy the moment. And I went out there, and Reagan was out there himself, getting the same thing as me, getting a breath of fresh air. So I thought, with Reagan, you didn't ask him big policy questions. His eyes glazed over. But I'm an equestrian. I loved riding. And so I said to him, when did you start riding? And he said, well, I was in the cavalry. And he saw the look on my face, like the old guy's going gaga. And he said, I joined the cavalry in 1938 when I got out of university, and they didn't get rid of the cavalry in the U.S. Army till 1941. That's a great bit of information. And at cocktail parties, whenever the subject of Reagan came up for a year, I would say to people, well, he was in the cavalry. And they'd say, where the hell did you hear that? I'd say, well, the president told me at dinner the other night. And they'd all be whispering at the end of the table, who is that guy? Who is he?
So the day after this great event...
a couple of days later, a friend of mine from CBS called me and said, boy, is Craig Oliver ever pissed about this. I said, who? He said, Craig Oliver. He's the head of public affairs, television and radio for the public television system.
It was his invitation.
I was supposed to be him.
And he was a friend of Nancy Reagan.
He was a friend of Nancy's. Well, she knew him, I guess. Yeah.
But she never said anything when
No,
this
although I have a photograph of my arrival, and she does look kind of puzzled, like, what? And in the back room, they must have... I did have a White House pass, so, you know, were they going to kick me out? I mean, I think I can understand. They must have been thinking, what are we going to do about this guy? And then they decided, well, we'll let him stay. I mean, I wasn't a security risk, and you know, I hadn't broken into the party.
You at one point you actually got your picture taken with Reagan.
Oh, a couple of times. Yeah.
One that you ended up sending to your mom.
Oh yeah, she liked that story. My mother, by now, well, she was still an alcoholic, but she was running a crummy motel in Prince Rupert, and American tourists stayed there quite often. And she took the picture of me and Reagan and put it in the lobby of the hotel. So all the tourists would come in and they'd say, "Oh, isn't this nice that you would honor us by putting our president up on the wall?" But who is that with him? And she'd say, well, that's my son. And they'd think, oh, no, the old gal, she's really gone. Well,
no, your mother, there's another story about your mother, too. I just thought of it now as you were saying that. Your mother giving Maureen McTeer the old 1-2 at some point.
Yeah.
Tell that story.
My mother did come back into my life when I was much later, thank God. And I had a semblance of a home life with her. But she kept getting ill and having to disappear. So anyway, well, Joe Clark had just become leader of the party, and he decided to do a tour of British Columbia. And everywhere he went, nobody showed up. I mean, nobody. And our float plane would arrive in these towns, and there'd be only a Mountie at the dock. There'd be no committee to meet him. There were no arrangements to do anything. Every day it got worse. We were all reporting it. The trip is going downhill. Joe's new leadership of the party is just bombing. Finally, we were in Prince Rupert, the last day of the trip, and Joe decided to have a news conference. And for some reason, whenever he had a news conference, Maureen liked to sit with him as if she was somehow the deputy leader. So I got up to ask a question at the news conference in Rupert, and my mother came to say me goodbye. It was at the airport. And Maureen burst out and said, "There you are, every night I'm sick of you crapping on my husband." And my mother stood up and said, "You leave my little boy alone, I'll come over there and kick you." And then Maureen shouted back, Joe's calming her down, I'm calming my mother down. And then when I got back home, I ran into Trudeau at a cocktail party, and he said, "You know what, you never worried me, but I don't ever want to run into your mother."
All right, now that you mentioned Trudeau, I want to ask you about the legendary canoe trips. Because you and a bunch of other guys started doing this early on, and you did it every year. You have canoed, and anybody who's worked in Ottawa knows that you guys did this. I remember hearing about this back in the '80s that you did this every year.
Yeah.
Tell me how this started, and tell me who made up the crew.
Oh gosh, altogether there were 10 guys, but about 6 to 8 would come every year. You know, I would send out a note early, and usually about January, and say, "Here's the river we're looking at. Who's interested in coming this year?" And then we'd winnow it down finally until people firmed up, and I got a check from them for the expensive float planes we had to. And for us, it was all north of the Arctic Circle. Anything south of the Arctic Circle was the Caribbean to us. All of these trips were very high up, which I think very few of us could afford now, because we have to fly in Twin Otters, land on big Tundra tires. It started with my friend Tim Kotcheff and I going to the Nahanni. We spent a summer training, and then the next summer we went to the Nahanni, and it was a pretty tricky place to be alone. It wasn't a park then, with nobody else on the river. Very lonely, strange, mystical place. And we realized that it's a very dangerous business to be doing those kind of trips alone. If you dump, you have no help. So then I started asking other people in politics and in journalism, would you like to join us? And gradually this became I think we called it the Rideau Canal and Antarctic Canoe Club. And they're very important friends.
Now, and you talk about the Nahanni back then not being a park and being remote, but some of these trips that you guys took, I mean, you weren't fooling around. This wasn't paddling down the Rideau Canal stuff. This was serious.
Big rapids, hundreds of very hard, very large rapids, weeks and weeks of rapids running. We made the most northerly trip in world history to the end of Ellesmere Island. We were only about, maybe 800 miles from the North Pole on the Ruggles River. And we got first the lake, Hazen Lake, which is where the Ruggles runs from, was frozen for the first time in years. I was beginning to worry that we're going to end up like the famous, Lost Expedition. And then when we started flowing down the river, there were big ice floes following us down. It got scarier and scarier, and finally the Parks Department came in with a helicopter and said, look, you guys better get off this river.
Yeah.
And we decided we would, so but anyway, that was a very exciting trip.
One of your canoeing companions on a number of those trips was Pierre Trudeau himself. And you write in the book about one particular instance, which I thought was a perfect example of what that guy's personality was like. Yeah. Him deciding to do something that the rest of you thought was just nuts.
This is the Bears.
Yeah.
Trudeau was fearless. Physically, he was fearless. And he really took to a challenge. He was a superb canoeist. He could run a rapid alone in a canoe and just dance it across the water. He really was good. Anyway, that isn't what that had nothing to do with what happened that day. We were on the river will come back to me. We were on this beautiful river, moving. It was a fast-moving river on a hot, sunny day, just floating. We're not paddling at all, just floating down the stream. And we went around a corner. Trudeau was in the lead canoe just by happenstance, and there were 5 grizzly bears sitting there eating a caribou lunch. Not long before, we had a caribou herd follow the river all around us. Somebody grabbed a horn, and the caribou took them along for a way. Anyway, so Trudeau, to my astonishment, pulled up in his canoe and ran up to see the bears, who, seeing the former Prime Minister coming, he was between Prime Ministers in that trip, they took off to a nearby hillock, and which Trudeau chased them up. And grizzlies are incredible. They can take your head off with a swipe, and they, don't like being crowded. This was very dumb, dangerous, reckless thing for him to do. And so I pulled an old revolver I had for that reason out of my pack and went chasing up the hill after him. And when I got there, the bears had now gone to another hill because they can outrun a horse, so that he wasn't going to chase them anymore. And I said to him, that was a foolish, reckless thing to do. You could have threatened the lives of all of us. Put all our lives at risk, because if one of these bears had attacked you, we might have wanted to come and try to help, and they would have killed us all. And he said, how many bullets you got in the gun? I said, 6. He said, well, there were only 5 bears. So no, you couldn't get an apology out of this guy. Although on another trip, he took the whole crew down the wrong direction after a lunch break. He headed off in the wrong direction. I'm the leader. I'm saying, hey, wait, I'm the leader. So he went 5 miles down into a dead end and had to come back in the wind and rain and against it. But they all followed him. Somebody said later that was the trouble with Trudeau. Even when he was wrong, he persuaded the country to follow him. But as he went by me that day, he said, sorry about that, Chief. That expression from Get Smart.
Yes. We have run short of time, Craig. This has been fabulous. I really appreciate you doing this. I've talked to you for hours. Thanks a lot for doing this.
Thanks a lot. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you.